Union. And that hint is the northern states had control of the House back in the early 1800s. The Compromise of 1850 allowed California into the Union, and that upset the balance in the Senate. There's only one more piece needed to pass bills into laws, which is what? What's the president? Yes. And what causes South Carolina and the rest of the states that rely on slaves for their economies is the election of an anti-slavery president. And that anti-slavery president was elected in 1860. And does anybody know the president yet?
Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln. So, Abraham Lincoln, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 causes the South to secede from the Union. Now, Abraham Lincoln was an anti-slavery president. Okay, so, are we done talking? Because some of us better be. Abraham Lincoln was a member of the anti-slavery party. And that anti-slavery party was called what? That was the abolitionists, but there was northern abolitionists that joined with Free Soil, which is what Lincoln was, against the expansion of slavery, but they all formed together to form what party that was against slavery in one form or the other? No. It's called the Republican Party. The Republican Party was formed basically by a bunch of people who were against slavery in some form or another. And the president that the Republicans would run and elect was Abraham Lincoln. And this causes South Carolina to secede from the Union because the Republicans had control of the House, which we'll just put north, the Senate. And that means, since they have a simple majority in both the House and the Senate, the only thing that they need to pass laws, which, because their whole foundation is stopping slavery, ending slavery, is the president. And in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. He's a Republican. And the South says, oh no. See, there goes slavery. If they want. Now, immediately, they're not going to end slavery, but still, they have the political capability to do it. They have a simple majority in the House, a simple majority in the Senate, and a president that would most likely sign a bill if it was passed. So, the South says, oh no, slavery ends, there goes our wealth, because the great wealth the South experienced was because of slaves. There goes any political influence we have. And as far as those that rely on slaves in the South, there goes our whole Southern way of life. So, the election of Abraham Lincoln was pretty much the last straw for the South. Now, though, not all South Carolinians wanted to end slavery. They did, or wanted to secede. Does anybody remember the fraction of slaveholders in South Carolina, even though it was the most of any state? 20%. Only 1 out of 5 people actually owned slaves. So really, only 1 out of 5 people would be experiencing this great economic loss where slavery ended. So naturally, not everybody was against or was for the South seceding. Because they knew that if the South pretty much divorces itself from the United States, that it's most likely going to lead to what? War and death. And 4/5 of people don't even own slaves. They're like, I don't know. I mean, yeah, sure, I do have a job with that involves slaves, but is it worth going to war? Okay. However, many still wanted to secede and was willing to risk war. Those that wanted to secede were, of course, called the secessionists. Those that wanted to stay were called the Unionists. And those that they wanted to secede, but they were scared about it. They were called the Cooperationists. Now, they were scared for a good reason, and they had good Cooperationists. Good reasons not to secede. I like to write careful Cooperationists. The Cooperationists know that if South Carolina secedes and they're the only state to secede, that the North is going to send their army and just blow the South to bits, and that's going to be the end of it. So what the Cooperationists wanted is they said, we should secede, but only as a last resort. Now, let's talk about, you don't really need to know these leaders, but they put a face to them. Now, first of all, were he still alive, states' rights and nullification, well, he passed away by now. If he was alive, yeah. The ghost of John C. Calhoun is screaming for secession. Because, you know, he'd been the political leader in South Carolina for all those years, and he would have been leading the secessionist movement. But he was dead. So, I would be, but I passed away. But I died. So, I just want to tell you, because that's where he would have been. He would have been leading the secessionist movement. You taking notes? Yeah. All right. So, and you don't even have to know these guys, but I like to use them to teach this. So I looked up a secessionist, and this guy tends to look like someone famous that we all know. No, his name's Robert Barnwell. He was a South Carolina planter, and he was one of the main secessionists, and like I said, you don't even need to know him. But he's unique looking because he looks like Colonel Sanders to me. Now, a little bit. Okay, so he was a secessionist, and I'll talk more about the secessionists in a minute. The Unionists, which my depiction of this guy tends to make him look like someone we know. No, I tend to think he looks like, I'll tell you who in a minute. Even though, no, he doesn't really look like this, but my drawing tends to make him look like the mother of the criminals on the Goonies. I think he looks like the Goonies' mother. His name is James L. Pettigrew, and he ends up being one of the leaders of the Unionists in South Carolina. And there's a lot of talk going across the tables, which should end. And the Unionists, they wanted to stay part of the Union. They agreed that they're not going to like it if the North passes laws against slavery, but maybe they fear the Civil War that will most ultimately occur. They didn't want to secede. They said the Constitution will protect South Carolina. It's not worth war seceding. So, they figured out that the Constitution, or they argued that the Constitution was well equipped to protect South Carolina. Now come the careful cooperationists. And if I draw this guy correctly, he will also look like someone that some of you may know. His name's James L. Orr, and he was a cooperationist that I found on the internet when I looked up who were the cooperationists in South Carolina. And if I draw him correctly, he will remind us of someone that is currently on TV. And as you're drawing him, I will give you hints as to who I think he looks like. Now, if I don't draw him correctly, he won't resemble this person. But the big thing about the cooperationists, they were careful. They only wanted to secede as a last resort. Now, I think he looks like someone on the History Channel on the show Pawn Stars. And what character does he resemble? Who is he? Who is he? No, he looks like Chum-Lee, that's right. Alright, so, now, the big thing. The cooperationists were careful. They said the South should secede, but only as a last resort. If other southern states do the same. Otherwise, it was a big mistake. So, we had these three groups, the secessionists, unionists, and cooperationists in South Carolina. Now, the ones that would eventually win this argument was, of course, the secessionists. Now, the secessionists were the most ardently against, or whatever I was trying to say, for breaking away from the Union. And they argued this in such a passionate manner. And they were the loudest voice at the convention. This is Robert Barnwell. I'm going to use Robert Barnwell here to illustrate the nickname that the secessionists were given. Pretty much whenever they're like, no, we shouldn't secede, the secessionists be like, yes, we should. So, the secessionists acquired a nickname that was, I think the word is illustrative of how they were at the...
What is that?
That is one of the hardest things to draw. Fire. So, the secessionists... Oh, we gotta draw his beard, because his beard's fireproof.
Are you still recording?
Yeah.
Is his beard on fire?
No. Okay. So, fire's hard to draw. Some of the, pretty much, they acquired this nickname. Now, it wasn't the fire breathers, because that would have been a great nickname. They were like dragons. They were called the fire, they called them the fire eaters. Now, maybe, I don't know why. They were also called the radicals. Hey, quit talking. Pretty much. Well, that's all right, because it's going to be more than a warning in a minute, because I am not in the mood to stop teaching every 5 seconds. So, pretty much the reason they acquired this nickname, radicals or fire eaters, was because every time they spoke, they're getting screamed at, and they're like they're all a bunch of dragons yelling at them, yeah, we gotta secede, but we should be careful. No, we don't. So, you know, they acquired this nickname called the Fire Eaters. Now, of course, this is review. He's not even in this section. But let's draw our buddy John C. Calhoun, because his ghost is there yelling, yeah, eat that fire, breathe it at those guys. Leave the Union. States' rights. Nullification. Secede. Eat that fire, breathe it at them Unionists and Cooperationists. Breaking apart from the Union is the only example, is the only answer for South Carolina. The issue is not debatable, but. The Fire Eaters, the secessionists, they're like, we are ready to secede back in the 1850s, as soon as we upset the balance in the Senate.
There's so many faces.
As early as 1850s events. The Compromise of 1850 led California into the Union, and that upset the balance in the Senate, and then they knew that it was probably over. Now, Lincoln's election in 1860 would cause most of the people in South Carolina to support the Fire Eaters. So, I'm going to go through a few things and then we'll move into the next thing. Because we have these disagreements, these differing opinions. However, most of South Carolina is going to lead towards seceding. But in order to say that all of South Carolina wanted to secede, you got to have a meeting. Now, so, here's the big thing about the Unionists. The Unionists said, no, remain part of the Union. I don't agree with the actions of the federal government, but the Constitution will protect South Carolina's way of life. They'd say that, the Fire Eaters would be like, oh, no, won't. Cooperationists, they were careful. Only secede if other southern states secede. Because if South Carolina secedes by itself, the North is going to send its powerful army down and blow us to bits. Secessionists, they're like, oh no, we need to secede. I don't know where Robert Barnwell is. Maybe that's him, I'm not sure. Maybe that's him. Well, the picture I looked up, I think I looked him up when he was older. But okay, so what happened is they had the South Carolina Secession Convention. Now, the South Carolina Secession Convention was supposed to be in the capital of Columbia. It was supposed to be at the First Baptist Church of Columbia. However, a familiar thing occurred. That's the First Baptist Church, and that's where it's supposed to be. Oh, First Baptist Church. Oh, well, were all important meetings held in Columbia, or where were they usually held? Charleston. And, you know, it was usually the Low Country being dirty. The Low Country was dirty again, and they bust out perhaps a lie, and it had to do with this little guy. It's a virus. What they did is, in order to get the convention moved to Charleston, they bust out rumors of a bad disease outbreak. Now, what disease ended up decimating the Native American population? That's right. I don't know how or if it was occurring, but maybe there was a case of smallpox in Columbia. I'm not sure. But the Low Country says that there's a smallpox outbreak in Columbia, so we can't have the secession convention there. So it was moved to Charleston, where support, for two reasons. One, the Low Country probably didn't want to travel that far. Two, this is where support for secession was the highest, was in Charleston. So what do? They spread a rumor about a disease outbreak, and they get it moved to Charleston, just like all the other important meetings. The meeting was quickly ended. What's it called when you end the meeting? It says meeting, adjourn. The meeting was quickly adjourned. Yeah, meeting adjourned, that means paused or ended.
Pause is recess.
Adjourn.
No, recess is whenever you, like, take a break.
It's a pause.
Yeah, recess is a break. Well, so, anyway, the meeting was quickly adjourned and moved to the Charleston courthouse, just the same way that they moved the ratification convention. Pretty much the Low Country still is dirty in their tactics to get all the important meetings held in Charleston. And the South Carolina Secession Convention was moved to Charleston. And here, the arguments for and against secession were laid out. Those that were brave enough to lay out ones against were pretty much breathed fire upon by yelling by the secessionists. And eventually, everybody was brought over to the same side which was, let's secede. Now, all the people voted for secession. Now, when all votes for something, what's that called? Unanimously. Good job. They voted unanimously. Even though all didn't agree, when they voted, they all voted yes for secession. And what they did is they drew up a paper and they sent it to Washington, and it was called the South Carolina Ordinance of Secession. So, they sent this paper to Washington, D.C., and this paper, it had all the same tunes that South Carolina had been playing for 40 years. It was a political statement, and it said all those things that you should be familiar with. South Carolina's been arguing for. It had to do with states' rights. It had to do with, it didn't really say nullification much because they're past nullification. It's mainly about states' rights. It said the federal government should not interfere with the decision-making and freedoms of the individual states. So, the states' rights argument went from nullification to secession, and when they sent this paper here, it was basically the same thing they were arguing, that we secede because you are interfering with our states' rights. So, the South Carolina Ordinance of Secession, Abraham Lincoln opened it up and said, yep, I knew it, darn. Now, Abraham Lincoln tried to avoid civil war, but eventually shots would break out. And does anybody know where those shots would break out? Fort Sumter. Now, we're going to learn about that maybe tomorrow.
That's in Charleston, isn't it?
Yep. That is the beginning of the Civil War and where the first battle was. States' rights should prevail over the federal government. This was sent to Washington, D.C., and that would force President Lincoln to make a decision. Now, South Carolina wasn't alone. 6 other southern states did, and more would after Fort Sumter. I'm going to go quickly through the remainder of the PowerPoint. So, this is all about Lincoln being elected 16th president. This is all about the convention being moved. And, I already said that. Here's the South Carolina Ordinance of Secession. Abraham Lincoln got this on his desk, said, there's a letter for you, President Lincoln. Congress read it too, I'm sure. And it said that South Carolina said they're divorcing us. They are breaking away. They are seceding. And they said, yep. And soon after, 6 other southern states seceded. There were some border states which had slaves, but they didn't secede until later. After Fort Sumter, Virginia split, and West Virginia was formed, and said, we're not breaking away, but that lower part is. North Carolina seceded later, Tennessee, Arkansas eventually, and they would form. Does anybody know the name of the blue states? See, that's right. They formed the Confederate States of America. But, and they said, we're not listening. We got our own president. His name's Jefferson Davis. Any questions?